Welcome everybody to this webinar with Will MacAskill, where we're going to try to examine the question of the most good that we can do. My name is Jack Lewis. I'm the Executive Director of One for the World, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the organisation in just a minute. And to aid that and to kick off the interactive side of this evening, because we really want to hear from you, we want you to be involved in this discussion, I'm about to launch a poll just so that I can find out how many of you know something about One for the World, and also how many of you have read one of Will's books. Nice to see some votes coming in for Will Who, which proves that people have suggests at least that people have dialed in okay, without the foggiest clue who you are. So yeah, please do fill that out. A little bit of housekeeping while you're doing that. So we're recording today's webinar, but my understanding is that only the panelists could possibly appear on this. Nonetheless, if that makes you in any way uncomfortable, feel free to dial off now, and this whole webinar will be available on YouTube and on the One for the World website afterwards, and we will send that out to you. It's a live Q&A, and there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen right now. You can put questions in there, and you can also upvote other people's questions. And my colleague Kenan, who might be able to give us a wave or might not, I think if he doesn't make a sound, you won't be able to see him, but I promise you he is waving. He's going to be monitoring the Q&A and just feeding questions into us, and we're going to try and get through absolutely as many as possible. So this is your chance to ask Will any questions that you have, and we really want you to engage and be part of the discussion today. So with that, it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Will MacAskill to this webinar. Will, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
I think it's probably fair to say, even though 60% of people have said Will Who in our poll, I think it is fair to say that you don't need a huge amount of introduction as one of the genuine thought leaders within the whole effective altruism movement across the world. But for any of you who aren't familiar with Will, he is one of the foremost thinkers and speakers and writers in this space. He's founded 3 incredibly consequential organizations within effective altruism that have raised awareness and also a staggering amount of money for effective charities. And he is currently an associate professor of philosophy at Oxford University and also a fellow at the Global Priorities Institute, which is one of the things that I hope he's going to talk more about later today. So Will, thanks so much for joining us. We're thrilled to have you with us.
Yeah, it's going to be great.
Perfect. Just for those of you, the 25% who don't know anything about One for the World, I'd just quickly like to tell you who we are and what we do. So One for the World is a movement of people who've pledged 1% of their income to try to end extreme poverty. Every single day, nearly 15,000 children under the age of 5 are killed by preventable poverty-related causes. So that might be because they don't have enough water to drink, or the water that they can drink is not clean. It might be because they don't have enough to eat. Or it might be because they get a disease that is totally preventable or totally curable, but they don't have access to the services that will let them recover from that, or indeed not get it in the first place. At One for the World, we think that that is not only unacceptable, it is totally and completely unnecessary. We are the first generation in history where research has shown over and over and over again that some interventions are incredibly effective at preventing these deaths. And so, benefiting from the work of organizations like GiveWell, which is our research partner, we can zero in on the causes where if you give them more money, they can do more of their work and they can simply stop these unnecessary deaths. And to put the level of the problem in context, nearly 15,000 children under 5 die from this every year. And that is the equivalent of a plane full of children under 5 crashing to earth and killing everybody on board just about every hour, every day. So we think there's an imperative to stop that, and One for the World is there to help you do that. If you take our pledge, you commit 1% of your income to these incredibly effective interventions that can save the lives of people who are dying unnecessarily in the developing world. And it's something that thousands of people are doing, and we would love you to join that number. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, please go on our website, onefortheworld.org, which Kenan's just put in the chat, and you can find out more about the organizations you support and about getting involved. But with that, I'm very keen to move on to our questions. And Will, I'm going to kick us off with a question from me, which is one of the privileges I get for being the host. I reread Doing Good Better, which I think is probably your most well-known work before this webinar, and you write a really robust defense of international aid in the book. you note that only $40 per head at the time, I think it was published in 2015, only $40 per head had been spent per person in sub-Saharan Africa at that point out of the aid budget, and that it had achieved some fairly amazing things. So my question is, are there any aid or development projects that you're particularly excited about right now?
Yeah, so I'll mention kind of two categories. So one is the idea of what's called an advanced market commitment. So that's where a government says, I'm willing to spend up to in one case, it was $2 billion, and this was a coalition of different governments, for a workable pneumococcal vaccine, where if you can create a pneumococcal vaccine at a given price, we will buy $2 billion worth of it. And this was a kind of idea designed by Michael Kramer, who's a Nobel laureate economist, and makes a lot of sense because it means that the government or an aid agency, rather than having to kind of pick winners by funding particular research projects, can just let kind of market forces do their work in order to incentivize innovation. And if it's not possible, if it doesn't happen, the aid agency doesn't have to spend anything. And so this advanced market commitment for the pneumococcal vaccine has saved estimates of about 700,000 lives. So extremely effective. And this is a mechanism that it seems could be used much more widely by these very large aid organizations, where the question of just how do you spend like many, many billions of dollars can be quite difficult. A second global health program that I'm particularly excited about is Target Malaria, which is a program to try to eradicate malaria by using gene drives, a very new technology, and it would make a particular strain of malaria-carrying mosquito infertile and would spread throughout the population. And one of the things I'm really liking about this organization is that they're taking the kind of ethical issues here seriously, being very cautious about it. And this is, again, a technology that could be much more widely used, could be very exciting indeed. 400,000 people a year, mainly children, die every year of malaria. That could go down to zero.
That's fantastic, and I'm really interested in both of those projects. So just to pick up on the first one, I've heard this idea actually floated in US politics as well, which is if we can guarantee a buy price for various vaccines, it incentivizes the companies to do the work, but it also prevents what some people think is profit gouging from having invented a medicine. It sounds like something that's going to be more of an institutional project than an individual donor project, or do you think that might be something where individual donors would be able to contribute to that kind of fund?
Yeah, it's the sort of thing where, unless you're a mega donor, Bill Gates and so on, who was involved in the first one, this is more something that individuals might be the case. They should be trying to push these large institutions, like the UK's Office for International Development or USAID to do, rather than, it's something where you benefit from having large amounts of capital at your disposal.
Yeah, and just to pick up on the second project that you mentioned, it's super interesting because I think something that's often said in the global poverty space is, and in the global health space is, well, these problems are unsolvable. But what we're really talking about here is potentially the eradication of malaria. And it sounds like that's a realistic goal. And I know you talk in the book about smallpox as well. So I wonder if you could talk about these examples.
Yeah, so smallpox eradication, I think, is one of the best things we've ever done. So, in the 20th century, smallpox killed 300 million people, even though we eradicated it in 1973. And for context, that's more people who died from smallpox than died in all wars, all political famines, all genocides, all terrorist acts combined. And it's, and that's not even counting all the people who are horrifically disfigured by the condition too. In fact, many people, it's really one of like a plague upon human civilization. Like many people would have so many blisters on their skin that would form a sheet, and they would just die from shock because the pain was so bad. Wow. But we were able to design a vaccine, roll it out globally, and thereby eradicate it, which is we estimate so something like 60 million lives in that time period. And most people nowadays don't even really know what smallpox is, even though it was a condition that goes all the way back to Egyptian times, perhaps even earlier than that. And it really is the case that, there are many, many problems in the world, but one by one we can solve them.
Yeah, which is just incredibly inspiring. And I think particularly this year where, there are times when I've felt in the grip of forces that are well beyond my control.
Yeah.
And it seems like the world has really struggled. That is incredibly reassuring to hear. We've got our first questions coming in from the audience. Rachel, I'm just going to skip past your question just for now, because I'm also going to launch another poll asking the audience what your cause areas that you're really interested in are. And I'd like to have that in front of us. So while we wait for people to complete that poll, which should now be on the screen in front of you, I'm going to take Kevin Bisson's question. So Kevin says, Will, what is your take on the good that could be done through remittance policies, as 3 times more money is sent through remittances, about $550 billion a year, I assume, than in international aid by affluent countries, the aid budget only coming to about 150 billion. And a lot of money is currently lost in transfer fees on those remittances. He also says, I'm doing a master's degree on that subject and I might cite your answer, which I trust is a joke, but there you go.
Yeah, it's a great question and spot on in terms of priorities. And in fact, there was a project, a company set up by people in the effective altruism community, Lincoln Quirk, who's a good friend of mine, called WAVE, or SendWave originally, which was precisely trying to do this project, making transfer fees cheaper. Initially, it started sending from Maryland to Kenya and then broadened out. And they were enormously successful, actually, quickly becoming one of the most major remittance companies from the US. Some of the challenges they faced. So I think, yeah, it's enormous potential. They do have a lot of, I think this is quite a hot area now. So there's a lot of kind of, if you're trying to do something similar, I think there's a lot of kind of competition there too. And there are challenges working with finance, including when you're bridging developed and developing countries. They definitely struggled with issues relating to corruption. It can be the case that you lose out on the market because your rival has bribed the right people. Can be a challenge. But yeah, I think it's enormously important. As well as making transfer fees smaller, the other thing you can do is try and increase rates of immigration. This is, an enormous challenge with a particularly anti-immigrant sentiment. But if you look at a country like Haiti, for example, more people have escaped poverty from Haiti by leaving and going to the US, where they then gain skills, send money back, often return with those skills to their home country at a later date. More people have escaped poverty that way than by staying in the country and getting richer. And so that fact, I think, strengthens this case for trying to encourage greater levels of immigration to some rich countries, at least.
Yes, and this is a good opportunity to give a plug to one of the charities that we recommend, which is Give Directly, where they have a very, very, very efficient model for remitting money. Well, technically, I think I'm misusing the word remitting because it's not for people who have moved to a different country to send money back. But when it comes to transferring money to people who are in areas where banking systems are not necessarily very robust and so on, they've got a fantastic way of doing that. And it was interesting to see them experiment with that within the United States during COVID. And I think our hope is that there's more discussion between them and the American government about whether they can make the distribution of aid and welfare benefits and so on more effective even within the United States as well as internationally. Right, I'm going to come on to the question about cause areas now, which we thought might come up. So first of all, Will, I don't know if you can see these results as well, but I'm just
yeah, I can.
briefly going to talk through them. So possibly not surprising, given that it's a One for the World webinar, global health and poverty is quite high on people's agendas. But decent scores for animal welfare and existential risk, and medical research, and then and women's empowerment, and then the kind of, I suppose, the tier between those two is social justice causes and education. So Rachel's question is, She says, "Hi, Will, thanks so much for doing this webinar. I'd like to know, organizations like GiveWell and One for the World focus strongly on combating global poverty from an effective altruist mindset. However, effective altruism is a broad movement that encompasses many ideas other than global poverty. Clearly, global poverty is an enormous and extremely pressing problem to tackle, but what are your thoughts on this distinction? Are there pros and cons to having this focus within the EA movement?"
Great. Yeah, so I think it's, yeah, I think your emphasis that EA is a broad movement is very important. And so GiveWell and Because of Doing Good Better mean that, you know, the global poverty element is the element of effective altruism that often appears most in the media. It's also kind of, it's very understandable and obviously extremely important. You can save a life for just a few $1,000s. But I do think of effective altruism as an idea as a broader concept than that. And importantly so. It's the idea of using evidence and reason to try and figure out how can we do as much good as possible and taking action on that basis. And that can be applied within many different cause areas. You can apply that within climate change. You can apply that within education. You can apply that to criminal justice. But then it can also be used to ask, like, what are the problems that we ought to focus on most? And within effective altruism, there tends to be, as well as focus on global health and development, also a focus on the welfare of non-human animals, especially in factory farms, and then on, which is something I've been focusing more on in recent years, issues that impact the very long run future. And what unifies this? Isn't that a bit of a Frankenstein set of causes to care about? Well, I think we can see it as kind of an expansion of a moral circle. So you start off just thinking, well, I want to benefit my own community, but then realize just everyone in the world today is of equal moral worth. Perhaps expanding the moral circle further is to think about non-human animals as being of important moral concern as well. Perhaps expanding it further again, appreciating, well, there's just so many generations to come. Future people might outnumber us thousands or even millions of times to one. So perhaps the best way we can do good, if it's possible to do so, is positively shaping the whole future direction of society.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on this as well from One for the World's point of view, because this is something we engage with the EA movement around a lot, because we only focus on global health and poverty. I would be the first to say this poll is not a scientifically rigorous sample. I want to throw that out there as a caveat. That being said, it is interesting to me that even within effective altruism, global health and poverty consistently rates as the cause area that people are most interested in, like quite consistently and not by a small margin. And so we see global health and poverty as the scaffolding that can bring people into this movement of effective altruism and thinking about effective giving. And hopefully we'll then see them go on to do other things. And one thing we were gratified to see this summer when we surveyed our members is that 1/3 of them had changed their career plans based on the principles of effective altruism. And also many of them were donating to effective charities that were outside global health and poverty. So we think that there is tentative evidence to suggest that your entry point can be global health and poverty, and that you can then move into this kind of broader effective altruism, effective giving space. I'd like to move now to a question from Kaleem. He says, as someone who's pretty involved with effective altruism, I understand why it's the best thing to do for EA to focus on influencing the actions and careers of super educated and powerful people in developed countries. However, it feels like EA is missing out on other people, people living in the developing world, or just regular people who might not be able to attain a well-leveraged job or degree. What is it that these people should do to be effective altruists? And is the EA community making a mistake by being too selective or potentially even selecting against underrepresented minorities?
Okay, it's great. Great set of questions, and there's lots there. In terms of kind of, you mentioned in particular people who maybe don't have as high a level of educational attainment. What could they do to be EAs? I think there's two things. I mean, I think donations are enormously powerful, basically and it is accessible basically for everyone. Again, coming back to this fact that just like a few $1,000s can save a life, that means like everyone can be a lifesaver. This is, especially, at least if you're born into a rich country and start donating, say, 10%. The other thing in particular is political action and activism too. I think it's a very powerful fact that we live in a democracy. Each individual's vote, I talk about this in Doing Good Better, is worth an enormous amount. And this is something where, because it's like it's a very small chance making a difference, but the difference that you make is so enormously huge. This is obviously very relevant at this point in time, but your ability to kind of campaign and make political change, as any individual, is, I think, very strong. Then the second question about kind of underrepresented groups. I'm kind of very pro having greater diversity than we've had in EA. We started off as mainly philosophers, which is a very narrow segment of society. And we've expanded considerably from then. Like, I'm really excited about the fact that we have local groups now in every continent in the world. So we have local groups in China, in India, in sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East, as well as the kind of English-speaking countries that we're more familiar with. I think that's, really important, both in terms of being able to have a truly global movement, something that can have a lot of outreach, and in terms of bringing like a wide variety of perspectives to the table. Very pro getting greater kind of intellectual diversity too. And this has been kind of a priority from CEA to try and start making that happen.
That's great to hear. I think it's also, this is another chance to just say something about One for the World, which is we're not pretending that we are the entry point to EA for everybody, because we largely recruit from elite universities. And so by the nature of the organization, many of the people who come into our movement are not diverse in terms of education level or even necessarily social background. But we are very, very, very passionately in favor of trying to make EA more accessible to people. And that's one of the reasons that we have a 1% pledge to work alongside the 10% pledge with Giving What We Can, is to try to reduce barriers to entry into this movement. So if you're interested in that, Colleen, do please reach out to us. We would love to talk to you about how we could try to bring a more diverse and set of people into EA and cast the net more widely. I've got a question from Akash here. He says, I'm interested in research that tries to promote effective altruism amongst audiences that haven't heard of EA. I've seen that some work on using logic or rational arguments alone tends not to have very strong effects. With this in mind, what do you think are the best strategies or approaches to use when trying to talk about or write about EA for non-EA audiences? And I'd just like to tack on to the back of this. One thing that struck me reading your book, Will, is that you're an extremely effective storyteller. And so I'd love it if you could talk a bit about the stories that you deployed in that book and why you did that.
Okay, great. So I think there's two things to say. So starting with Akash's question, there is this body of literature from psychology which suggests that, arguments don't work. Instead, it's emotional appeals. The issue with this literature is that it's about very small amounts of money. So it's often like 50 cents or $1 that's kind of under consideration. And talking with Paul Slovich, who's one of the leaders in this field, his view was that this doesn't really translate to such large decisions as giving 1% of your income or giving more, or changing your career or something like that, which is what I think are the really important decisions for people to make. And I've at least found that there just is this contingent of people who are much more willing to be moved by just argument, by giving people the facts. And they are not currently being kind of spoken to, because so much charity advertising is these emotional appeals that people are often quite, fatigued by. And so in terms of what people often get wrong when trying to present EA to new people, I think one thing often is trying to do like emotional appeals or trying to, be very angry. Like I used to be a charity fundraiser for global development charity, and I was like, I'd just gotten involved, just started being concerned. I was like raging at people, and I really did not make very much money for the charity at all in virtue of doing that. Whereas, and I think it's very justified to be very angry at the injustice in the world that so many people have so little well, we have so much. But as a strategic matter, being kind of upbeat and cheery and, you know, taking this positive framing of like how much you can do is very important, and just seems to be more effective. And then, yeah, on this question of storytelling, so I am indeed kind of unusual, like Doing Good Better is not a typical philosophy book. It is very story heavy. I do think it's the case, you know, stories are a double-edged sword. From the perspective of having accurate beliefs, it can be the case that stories can really mislead you. I'm actually not a big fan of political satire as a genre, because it's like, I'm going to paint this picture and it'll be very vivid, but that's not an argument. That's not appealing to my reason, my ability to, you know, think through the best evidence that I have available to me. So I think the kind of right strategy to do is to have this process of thinking about, you know, trying to weigh up the evidence that's available to us, and then try and form the right views or the best ideas, and then accepting that people are humans and that stories are how ideas spread. If you want a fun fact, I learned that many of Aesop's fables, like the idea of a fox who saw the boy who cried wolf, or the idea of sour grapes, actually goes back 2,500 years. And we still kind of repeat these stories as little lessons. Similarly, you all know about the drowning child story from Peter Singer. It's just enormously powerful at conveying a certain set of ideas. So I do think very carefully and deliberately about how can I take these ideas, how can I make them vivid and rooted in kind of concrete reality. And if this is something you're interested in doing more, the best book in my view on this topic is called Made to Stick. And it gives a kind of formula that I have used over and over and over again in terms of trying to make what are often abstract ideas concrete and compelling.
A follow-up question on this from Charles Kay, whom we know well because he interned with us this summer and is a chapter leader at One for the World. He says, to paraphrase slightly, when are you going to write the Communist Manifesto of Effective Altruism? And do you think that there is a case for having a much kind of shorter definitive text to help spread EA?
Thanks. So, yeah, the Effective Altruist Manifesto. So I love the idea. I think I have been thinking about a follow-up to Doing Good Better. In particular, one that perhaps takes a more kind of personal route in, kind of introduces the ideas kind of via the community. I haven't thought about having an Effective Altruist Manifesto. The obvious worry is that I think nuance and subtlety is, you know, very important, and it has been sometimes frustrating in the past to see how, when I've engaged with the media, the ideas kind of necessity get simplified, such that effective altruism becomes only about earning as much money as you can to donate to randomized controlled trial-backed charities, and is very dogmatic and so on, whereas that's really not what we're like at all. But at the same time, yeah, perhaps it could be particularly, perhaps if it were done well, it could be particularly powerful. So I'll have to think about that.
Okay. Another communication question. I'm just trying to group the questions by theme, guys, if you're wondering why I haven't picked yours yet, but we will get to all of them if we have time. This is from Morgane, who says, hello, thanks for offering us your time. My question concerns effective altruism in general. What's the most common objection or criticism that you're faced with, and how do you deal with it?
Hey, so yeah, the most common objection I have gotten in the past is about concerns systemic change. And the claim is that EAs can't think well about systemic change, or neglect it, or don't focus on it. And I spent many years engaging with people about this because I was really confused, because there are many things we do within effective altruism that clearly are about systemic change. So certainly Give Well charities takes a while to define what systemic change means, but let's assume that they're not that. Firstly, that doesn't mean it's bad. If you have saving life is like super important, and it's an open question if you can do that extremely cheaply, whether some systemic change thing is better. but there's lots of things we do, certainly within the other cause areas of animal welfare, long-term issues like pandemic preparedness, like climate change, like around artificial intelligence, are just clearly all in the category of systemic change. And also even things within global development. So Center for Global Development is a think tank we funded for a long time. And I think what it comes down to ultimately is actually that many people have a kind of strong anti-capitalist stance and think that, well, clearly the root of all these problems is capitalism, is global capitalism. And if you're not attacking global capitalism, then you're really missing the thing. And there, I think we just have a kind of empirical disagreement where, from my perspective, the best countries in the world, like the most well-functioning countries, and in fact, the most well-functioning countries historically, the Nordic countries, so Scandinavia, Finland, also particularly like the Netherlands, Denmark as well. And that's where you've got this kind of mix of, private ownership, but very large amounts of redistribution and very good public provision of public services. And so, whereas when I look at non-capitalist countries historically, such as the kind of communist experiments in Mao's China or the USSR, or in many poor countries, they tend to have gone very badly wrong. And so, is our current kind of basis economic system the best one? Like, no, there's tons I want to change. Future world will have discarded it to history. But like, of the things that I think I can realistically push on and actually change in the world and make better, it doesn't enter my top 10.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I'm going to clip out the sound of you saying global capitalism is the root of all problems and play it on loop on our homepage to get more
Okay,
clips.
good.
Sorry about that, mate.
Add that to a memes page.
Just looking through if there are any other that are on communication. It looks like we've got a group of questions around cause areas. So I'm going to go into those now. So Anissa has said, thanks for spending your time with us. What are your thoughts about nuclear security as an EA cause area? Should EAs focus more on this cause as an existential threat? And just before you answer that, we're super interested in this at One for the World, because when we're talking about bridging from near-term causes like global poverty into other areas like long-term causes, it seems to me intuitively that nuclear disarmament might be a really good bridge for doing that.
Okay, terrific. So yeah, I mean, I think nuclear security in the world as a whole is radically neglected. So people just don't think very much about the fact that there are still, I think it's 8,000 warheads in the US and USSR. People also don't think about just the sheer historical base rate of war between major economies, where we've had 70 years of just what historians call the long peace. So take all the wars that you hear about every year. This is actually a very unusually peaceful time. And I don't think we should be very confident that that won't continue over the next kind of 80 years. And if that led to a nuclear war, then yeah, that would just be a catastrophe of just unimaginable proportions. In terms of nuclear war as an existential threat, I think I do want to, sometimes it is just led, like nuclear war would cause a nuclear winter, that would kill us all. I actually think that's very unlikely. I think if there was a nuclear war, it would be kind of apocalyptically bad. I think it's almost certain that, yeah, humanity would survive as a result, especially even in the kind of worst case nuclear winter scenarios. New Zealand always ends up being fine. I don't know if anyone's from New Zealand here, but
yeah, you're the last haven for everybody in pandemics and also in global nuclear war, I'm afraid.
Yeah, but there's still worries about, this such a war kind of just derailing civilization and setting us on the wrong path. So I am in general very, very in favor of kind of more focus being directed towards that.
Excellent. Another question that ties into long-termism. This is from Caden, who I know is a One for the World pledger, so welcome, Caden. I often see long-termists downplay the benefits of global poverty and development work in favor of more direct existential risk work. I'm of the belief that long-term benefits of global health and development work are not trivial. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I agree they're not trivial. And I think that is important. Like, it's easy to have this kind of biased assessment when you're comparing between two cause areas, where if for one sort of activity, you're looking at like the whole stream of benefits from now all the way to, the end of civilization, the Earth is no longer habitable in hundreds of millions of years' time. And then when you look at global development work, you only look at the kind of short-term effects on the person you're helping. Whereas you should be thinking about that long stream of long-run benefits via having, for example, a world where the world as a whole is just a little bit better educated, like a little bit happier, a little bit richer, therefore less likely to engage in perhaps like destructive civil conflicts or larger conflicts. You've got to think about that kind of long run stream of benefits into the future at the same time. So if kind of people from the long-termist perspective are downplaying that, I think that's a mistake. At the same time, it would be like very unlikely, it would be very surprising if the very best kind of programs for benefiting people in the near term over the next 10 to 20 years are also the best things to benefit, to do the most good over the very long run. And the reason for that is just there's loads of things you could be doing, hundreds of thousands of different activities. And if you just selected the very best one on one dimension, it's unlikely to be the very best thing on another dimension too. Just like, the tallest person in the world is unlikely to be the smartest person in the world. Or any other kind of two different traits. And so it would be like a surprising coincidence if we thought those two things were the case. If they were both best near-term thing was the same as the best long-term thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Another question about long-termism from Henry. I think this is quite a common question about long-termism. He says, hi Will, I've read and heard a lot about the case for long-termism, but the key element that fuels my skepticism is my concern that we have no way of knowing if the work we put in today will actually have an effect on the very long term. In other words, we can't know if we're pushing the boat or pushing a landmass. This leads me to prioritize short and mid-term issues. Can you speak to this concern?
Terrific. Well, I'll plug my next book, but that will be a couple of years' time, which is addressing this in full book length. And there's a couple of things to say. So yes, I think we definitely can't know that we can have very long run impact. It's just a matter of kind of probabilities. So thinking, will this action, what's the probability that this action will have led to the world being better rather than worse in many centuries' time, or even 1,000 years' time, or even longer? And I think there we can start to say, yeah, it's more likely than not. And then when the stakes are really big, the more likely than not can mean it's like still a very good thing to do, even though we don't have certainty. And I think there's two classes of things. And then you might think, well, but everything just washes out over time. Any kind of action, it's just like ripples, doesn't have a long run effect. But I think there's at least two categories of thing that do potentially have very long run effects. So one is the extinction of the human race. So if Homo sapiens were to go extinct, it is astronomically unlikely that we would kind of re-evolve and recreate civilization. Perhaps it's the case that some other animal would evolve higher intelligence and create civilization. I think there's reasonable arguments against that too. But either way, we certainly shouldn't be very confident that that would come back. Once you're extinct, you just can't come back from that. And so that really is something that if you manage to make that difference, then that's an effect that persists forever. The second thing is cultural change, or values change in particular, where it is values, the kind of values or culture of a time seem to be remarkably persistent over time. So you can look at lots of differences in the world today and chart those differences to differences like thousands of years ago at the formation of the world religions. And you can actually do this over and over again. You can look at differences in gender norms today as a result of differences in agricultural practices like hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago. You can look at levels of social trust today and the number of slaves that were taken from a country many, many centuries ago. And I think, so this is something that can be like very persistent, and it's actually persistent for the same reason that species or loss of species is so persistent, because it's like a kind of self-replicating code. So just as DNA replicates itself and keeps going into the future, similarly, these kind of cultural traits or values kind of replicate themselves into the future. And though you start having to get into some kind of science fiction scenarios, I think there's plausible case for thinking that in the not too distant future over the next few centuries, the world could lock into a particular set of values, where that's the most compelling cases when this is driven by AI. So perhaps there's some dictator is able to develop very advanced AI, uses that power to take over the world, wants the vision of their party to continue indefinitely. And then if you've written it down on code and you've got a kind of army and police force that's automated, you can just continue the enforcement of those values indefinitely into the future. There's no reason why not. So the fact that there's a lot of kind of values change at the moment doesn't mean that's not going to be the case into the future. And this is something where we really can predict, you know, if you tell me that there's some society in 10,000 AD, well, there's two different societies, I don't know anything about them, but in one, slavery is legally sanctioned and widespread, and another one, slavery is not. I can tell you which society I would, you know, I think we should try and make happen. And so this, you know, values is the other thing where I think we can potentially have long-run influence and long-run predictability. Even though I do think in general, yes, most things tend to unpredictability over this, you know, timescale of decades, centuries or longer.
Great, thank you. Another question from Joe from New Zealand, which has a long-term aspect to it. So they say, you mentioned the gene drive to eradicate mosquitoes, and there's recently been hype about biodiversity protection. Considering this from a moral uncertainty point of view, what do you think are the risks that we are doing a lot of harm by messing with natural species in the ecosystem in this way? And then they say, as a side note, I'm in science and I worked for the World Mosquito Program, so this is a devil's advocate question.
Okay, terrific. So on the question of biodiversity protection in general, I think this is actually something where, yeah, the kind of effective altruists and long-termists and environmentalists just should have a lot of overlap, where you lose a species if you haven't stored the DNA. Again, it's just like an irreversible loss. You've not got that again in the future. And that could be because it has instrumental value, though the case for that is often a little bit hand-wavy. But also just many people think that this has, you know, preservation of species has non-instrumental, like final value, intrinsic value. And if you're taking moral seriously, certainly you should take that seriously too. And then at the same time, it's often just very easy to preserve species, especially if just what we're doing is kind of logging DNA. On the particular case of gene drives and eradication of mosquitoes, in this case, I think we just need to be very careful about interference with natural ecosystems. I think the case in this, I think there's a pretty strong qualitative case for thinking that's not a major risk in this case, for two reasons, which, and I'm sure you could speak about this much better than I could. One being that often these are areas where the mosquitoes are aliens, like they're invaders, they're actually quite recent in that ecosystem. And secondly, it's just one type of mosquito. There are many other types of mosquito too, and it's just that this one type happens to, or maybe one or two types happen to carry malaria. So it's hard to see how there could be some sort of massive long-term kind of domino effects that would have very bad kind of long-term consequences.
Excellent. Okay, there's another batch of questions that I'm going to move on to now, which is about giving and pledging. And I'm gratified that we're going to be able to do a sort of meta combination here, because I'm both going to launch a poll about the people on this call and whether or not you have taken any type of giving pledge. And at the same time, I'm going to ask a question from an anonymous attendee who said, how important or beneficial is it for One for the World and Giving What We Can pledges to communicate their giving well? And what does communicating one's donations look like? Is that writing about it, sharing it publicly, something else?
Right. Yeah, and that's a fantastic question. So one of my favorite so I think it is important to communicate it well. And the argument for this is very simple, which is think of all the good that you do via your donations over the course of your lifetime. And then imagine you can convince one other person to do the same. Well, you've done your life's work over again. You've doubled the amount of good. And perhaps you can actually do that many times over by promoting these ideas. And how should you do that then? Well, here I think I think there's bad ways and good ways to do it. Kind of, as I said before, it's, I think, a very natural thing. This is exactly how I was when I first started, is being angry and aggressive and making people feel uncomfortable, calling people murderers for not giving more. I think that's, again, understandable. It's not very effective. And so I think being an inspiring, positive leader is the way to go. So it's like, I give this. I don't think of it as sacrifice. I think it's actually rewarding and improving my life. I'm talking about this because I think it's this great thing I do. And I'm like really encouraging you to do the same. I'm offering you to talk as much as, like, I'm happy to talk as much as you like about giving, about the particular cause areas I support and how I do the kind of logistics of it. And, you know, in a non-pushy way, I'm going to talk about this just like quite a lot. And perhaps at some, you know, at the occasional point, I will be a little bit more direct. Just ask someone, well, do you, you know, we've talked about this a lot now. Do you think you do want to take a pledge to give in a, you know, polite but straightforward way? But otherwise, just trying to be this positive vision. And that means as well, like cautioning against, again, one of the things I went through was thinking, you start taking these ideas so seriously and you want to just really push yourself very hard. But one of my favorite blog posts is by Julia Wise on Giving Gladly. It's called Cheerfully. And it's just about the importance of having that attitude to the work you do, the giving you do. If you're someone who's, you know, giving a large percentage of your income or really making drastic decisions, but you're completely miserable and you're turning other people off from doing the same, well, that's a bad move. You want to have a level such that you can talk about this in an excited, positive way. And that's the way of inspiring other people to do the same.
I would just pick up on this from my own experience, that I think particularly there's actually quite a big cultural difference here between the UK and the US. So giving is much more widely discussed in the US and, in my experience, much more celebrated. And actually it ties into loads of parts of the culture there, which is the way that wealth is perceived within the society, which I think is quite different between the UK and the US, expectations around giving and so on. What I've noticed in the UK is it has had a profound effect on some people in my social circle for me simply to have just told them what giving I do. And I think there's a kind of, it might be a sort of anchoring effect, or it might be to do with, you may know this phrase from politics of the Overton window, where you can move the window of normal discussion. I have had people where I think when I've said that I'm a Giving What We Can pledger and I One for the World pledger, and I said, well, I give about 12% of my income to charity, and I've seen people visibly do a double take. And partly because I think they all know that they're paid more than me because they use their degrees to much greater effect than I did in monetizing them. And so I think that there's a beneficial effect there for, you can just kind of surprise people into thinking about giving in a different way. So I would encourage you to talk about your giving as well. We may be about to relaunch the last poll because several of you pointed out that I am not a loss to survey design, as I didn't let you choose more than one poll giving pledge at the same time. And I also didn't let you say, no, I don't take any type of giving pledge at all, which is just a very strong indicator that I am not I'm not a big loss to the monitoring and evaluation community within effective altruism. While people are filling that out, really interesting question from Abhishek. who says, One for the World encourages new graduates to donate 1% of their postgraduate earnings, and Giving What We Can encourages 10% of one's income. However, I can envisage an argument for those in privileged backgrounds, from privileged backgrounds, to donate much more, given how much good can be done by just giving 1% more or 2% more. What are your thoughts on much larger giving levels approaching 50% or beyond? Should we be encouraging people to do this? And if it's good, how can we make it more widely accepted?
Yeah, it's a great question. And indeed, Giving What We Can originally was actually had a larger pledge than this. So in fact, Giving What We Can itself has two pledges. There's the regular 10% pledge, and there's the further pledge, where you pick a certain income, and you can give more than 10%. So the average donation level within Giving What We Can members is much more than 10%. But you can also go even further and say, I'm willing to say, okay, this is my threshold, and I'm just going to give everything I earn above that. And that's famously what Toby Ord did with £18,000 in Oxford, 2009 pounds. So that's probably about £25,000 now. And quite a number of people have agreed to do that too. That is my intention. I haven't taken it formally as a pledge because I'm just worried about various caveats, but I do every year give everything I earn above about £27,000. And the reason we didn't do this is just trying to maximize the amount of money we think we can move, where if you've already given the arguments for 10%, then, and people have gotten up to that level, well, probably we've pushed them such that people can start giving much more again. I think there is an argument for the kind of ultra wealthy to have, an even larger pledge percentage, but Bill Gates got there first and has obviously had enormous success with the Giving Pledge, which is for billionaires to pledge to give at least 50% of their wealth. And that's obviously been very successful. It's possible that there's space for an organization that's more general, like 50% of giving, and that's really their kind of core focus, but not restricted to billionaires. It's plausible to me that that could do reasonably well as well. But I think we've at least found very many people, people start with 10%, but they don't stop there.
Yeah, and you might be interested to know, I just found this out today, but Founders Pledge have actually changed the way that they talk about pledging. So this is for people who founded companies and give equity to Founders Pledge. So if they ever sell the company or it floats publicly, they are legally obliged that the proceeds of that equity are guaranteed to go to charity. You can never break that pledge once you've done that. They actually are anchoring at 50% now. And so anyone who wants to give less than that has to drag down the amount that they're pledging. And they've seen a noticeable increase in the amount that people are pledging through that, which I thought was interesting. One for the World is really interested in whether we can take people who initially give 1%, become comfortable with that, and then help them to graduate on to higher amounts over time. So watch this space. Guys, I'm very conscious of time. There are a couple of questions I want to get through, and I know Will has a hard stop. So I'm sorry if we don't get to your question, but I'm going to prioritize two that have been upvoted. So the first is from William Keeley, who says, do you believe the primary benefit of One for the World and Giving What We Can projects over the next couple of decades will be the additional funds raised for effective charities by pledges, or something else? For example, the effects that these communities will have on changing the conversation around cost effectiveness and cause prioritization?
Okay, fantastic question. So, we often talk about how the best things are far, far better than just kind of typical charities. And when I think about the success of Giving What We Can, One for the World, I also think that probably much of the benefit is in this kind of tail of like the very best scenarios. And there I get quite idealistic, where I can imagine a scenario where the idea of giving 10% of your income is as kind of morally ingrained in the world, in world culture, as the idea of not stealing or not telling lies or not being racist. And so, there's a big strain in common sense morality where it's about, you don't do things that harm other people, and as long as you've done that, then you're kind of a good person. Whereas we're pushing this to say, no, actually, positively helping others is like also part of being a good person. And you do get kind of cascades where if it's the case that everyone is, you know, not an altruistic person, then there's no pressure to do so. But then you get up to a certain percentage of the population and then, you know, flips to everyone being like that. And then that just seems like a lot better world, like not just through the donations, but also you've got just this general culture of people being like very willing and positive to help other people in an altruistic way. Feels like a much safer world too. And so that's at least what leaps to my mind when I think about a really kind of good case outcomes for giving what we can and one for the world over the coming decades. And that it does just go via the kind of greater amounts of generosity. The kind of counter argument is perhaps when I look at the kind of success of effective altruism over the last couple of decades, and last decade. And when I think about the differences in impact between different cause areas, I probably would have to say that the emphasis on effectiveness has been the bigger contribution than the emphasis on giving more, because different areas vary by just so much in terms of how effective they are.
That's great. Guys, I'm afraid I just don't think we're going to have any time for the remaining questions because I want to wrap up in good time. I'm going to launch a quick poll now because I want to talk about what you can do next. So first of all, we would love you to consider taking the One for the World pledge, or indeed the Giving What We Can pledge. And if you would like to have a conversation about that, just fill out this poll and we'd be delighted to follow up with you. Obviously, there is no pressure either way, but we think it's a fantastic thing to do. We think Will's articulated that really well. If you would like to stay involved, we have other webinars coming up. We have Julia Wise, who gives away over 50% of her income with her husband, and Steve Hind, who gives away a substantial part of his income, joining us to talk about how much we could reasonably give, which is something that's come up quite a lot today in just 2 weeks. And then we have Toby Ord talking about how the world might end and what we can do about it at the end of October, which we're all excited about, assuming we get there. Because if you've read The Precipice, you should be in a permanent state of agitated fear. Will, thank you so much for coming and joining us. We really appreciate it. Someone said in the questions, you're a rock star. They're not wrong. This is by far the best attended webinar we've had. We reached a high watermark of 145 people, which is fantastic. So thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. And yeah, I'm so honored so many people turned up, and sorry that we didn't get to get through more of the questions. They were really spot on. So thank you so much.
Great. I'll send everybody your email so that they can follow up one-to-one following the webinar. So yeah, if you'd like to take action, let us know if you want to have a chat about the pledge. Definitely attend our future webinars and tell people about this and send them the YouTube link when we send it out to you. But for now, just as a close, Will, thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you. Okay, bye.